The news reached Earth in 7 minutes. That was how long it took for a priority signal to travel from the relay station above VoteHFY Prime to the communications array in Geneva, where the United Earth Coalition had its headquarters. 7 minutes for the message to cross half the galaxy. 7 minutes for the world to change. President Laura Beckett was sitting in her office when the alert came through. She was 53 years old, a former naval officer who had served on the first human deep space patrol vessel before entering politics. She had a calm face, the kind of face that reporters called unreadable, and a reputation for never raising her voice, even when the situation called for shouting. She read the message once, then she read it again. Then she stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city of Geneva below her, at the lights of a world that had no idea what was coming. She picked up the phone and called Admiral Greg Holt. Greg was 61 years old and built like a man who had spent his entire life carrying heavy things. He had a thick gray beard, deep lines around his eyes, and hands that were rough from decades of service. He had commanded the fleet during the Titan insurrection 12 years ago, a short and ugly conflict between Earth and a separatist colony on one of Saturn's moons that most people preferred to forget. He had won that fight, but he had never celebrated it. War was not something Greg Holt celebrated. When the president told him what had happened, Greg was quiet for a long time. Then he asked one question. "How long do we have?" 60 days, Laura said. "That is not enough time. That is why I am activating Lodestar." Greg went silent again. Protocol Lodestar was something that lived in the deepest classified files of the Earth Defense Ministry. It had been designed 15 years ago by a small group of military planners who believed that the assembly would one day turn on humanity. Most people in government thought they were paranoid. Most people in government had been wrong. Lodestar called for the complete militarization of the Sol system in 90 days. 30 days longer than they had. But Greg Holt was not the kind of man who let math stop him. Within 6 hours of the call, things began to move. The Fenris shipyards, a massive construction facility hidden inside the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, came alive for the first time. It had been built in secret over the past decade, buried inside hollowed-out asteroids and shielded from any sensor that the assembly might point in its direction. Inside its cavernous bays sat the skeletons of warships, vessels designed using a combination of human engineering and alien technology that no assembly species knew Earth possessed. The shipyard workers, most of whom had been told they were building commercial transports, were briefed on the real nature of their work. Some of them were frightened. Most of them got angry, and angry humans worked fast. On VoteHFY Prime, Nate Caldwell stayed. The assembly had given Earth 60 days to comply, and during that time, the human embassy was still technically protected by diplomatic immunity. Nate had a skeleton crew of 6 people with him. Katie Marsh was his communications officer, a young woman from Virginia who had a gift for languages and a habit of biting her nails when she was nervous. She was biting them a lot now. Danny Rowe was his security chief, a broad-shouldered man from Texas who had served in the Marine Corps before joining the Diplomatic Protection Service. Danny did not talk much, but when he stood behind Nate during meetings, alien diplomats tended to keep their distance. Nate had a plan. It was not a good plan, and he knew it, but it was the only one he had. He needed to buy time. Every day the assembly spent talking was a day Earth spent building, and he needed information. He needed to understand why the vote had really happened. Because his gut told him there was something deeper going on, something the council had not said out loud. He reached out to Sur. The meeting happened 3 days after the vote, in a sealed maintenance tunnel beneath the human embassy. It was not the kind of place where galactic diplomacy usually took place. The walls were bare metal, the lights were dim, and the air smelled like recycled coolant. Nate sat on an overturned supply crate. Sur stood across from him, the old Berlitzi's wide body hunched slightly in the low corridor. Sur looked tired. The Berlitzi were an amphibian species, with smooth greenish skin and large dark eyes that always seemed to hold more emotion than their words expressed. Sur had been a diplomat for over 60 years, longer than Nate had been alive, and in all that time, the old ambassador had never broken protocol like this. "You should not have stayed," Sur said. The Berlitzi voice was deep and wet, like stones rolling in a river. "I know," Nate said. "Tell me why they did it. The real reason." Sur was quiet for a moment. Then the old diplomat reached into a fold of fabric and pulled out a small data crystal. "Every elder species runs predictive models. Growth rates, cultural influence, technological adoption curves. They run these models on every new species that joins the assembly. It is standard practice. When they ran the models on humanity, the results were unlike anything they had ever seen." "What did the models say?" "They said that within 200 years, humans would be the single most influential species in the galaxy. Not through military power, not through economic dominance, through innovation, through cultural spread, through your species' complete inability to accept a boundary and stay behind it." Every model, every scenario, every simulation came to the same conclusion. Humanity does not plateau. Humanity does not slow down. You simply keep going, faster and faster, and everything around you changes to keep up. Nate stared at the crystal in his hand. "They are afraid of us." "They are terrified of you," Sur said. The vote was not punishment. It was containment. They looked at the future and they saw a galaxy shaped by human hands, and it frightened them more than any war ever could. Nate put the crystal in his jacket pocket. He felt the weight of it there, small and cold against his chest. "Sur, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. Ask. If it comes to a fight, where do the Berlitzi stand?" The old ambassador's dark eyes held Nate's gaze for a long time. "The Berlitzi have never gone to war in our history. We are not warriors. We are not soldiers. We are diplomats and scholars and farmers." Sur paused. "But we have also never stood by while an innocent species was destroyed. If it comes to that, you will not stand alone." Nate nodded. He did not trust his voice to say anything more, so he simply nodded, and the two of them sat in that cold, dim tunnel beneath the embassy and said nothing for a while, because sometimes silence between friends was enough. Back on Earth, the shipyards worked around the clock. Admiral Greg Holt moved his command to the ESS Longhorn, the first completed warship to roll out of the Fenris facility. It was not the biggest ship ever built. It was not the most heavily armed. But it was fast, and it was tough, and it was human. And Greg Holt loved it the way a man loves something he built with his own hands, even though he had not welded a single plate. His executive officer was Commander Lily Tran, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s, who had served with Greg during the Titan campaign and had a reputation for being the calmest person in any room during a crisis. She had a dry sense of humor that Greg appreciated, mostly because she only used it when things were genuinely terrible, which meant she was using it a lot these days. "How many ships can we get operational before the deadline?" Greg asked her on the 14th day. Lily checked her numbers. "If we cut every corner and skip half the safety tests, maybe 280. 300 if we get lucky." "And how many will the assembly send?" Intelligence estimates put the enforcement fleet at between 8 and 10,000 ships. Lily looked back at him. Neither of them said anything about the math. The math was not good. The math was terrible. But Greg Holt had been in terrible situations before, and the one thing he had learned in his 61 years of life was that the math only mattered if you played the game the way your enemy expected you to play it. He had no intention of doing that. "Get me the engineering team," he said. "I have an idea." On the 59th day, the sky above Neptune changed. It started as a shimmer, like heat rising off a summer road, except it stretched across thousands of kilometers of empty space. Then the shimmer broke open, and the Assembly's enforcement fleet poured through, ship after ship after ship, dropping out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation. The sensor arrays on the outer edge of the Sol system counted them as they arrived. The number climbed past 1,000, past 3,000, past 5,000. It kept climbing. 9,214 warships. 6 species had contributed vessels. The Scytharan Dominion alone had sent over 3,000, including their flagship, the Pale Silence, a dreadnought so large that it had its own gravity field. The Droon had sent 2,000 heavily armored cruisers that looked like floating fortresses. The Malaxi contributed 1,000 sleek, fast interceptors. 3 other elder species filled in the rest with destroyers, carriers, and support vessels. It was the largest military fleet ever assembled under a single command in the recorded history of the galaxy, and it was pointed at Earth. Admiral Greg Holt stood on the bridge of the ESS Longhorn and watched the sensor display fill with red contacts. The bridge was quiet. His crew, many of them fresh out of training and young enough to be his grandchildren, sat at their stations and did their jobs. Their hands were steady. Their faces were not. Lily Tran stood beside him, her arms crossed, her dark eyes scanning the readout. 9,000 and change, she said. Her voice was flat. That is a lot of ships. It is, Greg agreed. We have 297. We do. That is roughly 30 to 1. I can count, Lily. She almost smiled. Just making sure. The human fleet was arranged in a loose formation about 200 million kilometers from Earth, roughly between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter. 297 ships. Some of them were proper warships, built in the Fenris shipyards with the best technology humanity could produce. Others were converted civilian vessels, cargo haulers and mining ships, fitted with weapons and shields that had been bolted on in a hurry. They were not pretty, but they were there, and the people inside them had volunteered to be there, every single one of them. Behind the fleet, stretching across a vast arc of space, was something else entirely. It looked like a chain of satellites, hundreds of small devices arranged in a precise geometric pattern, each one connected to the next by a thin beam of energy that pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm. The assembly's sensors could detect the devices, but they could not identify them. Their analysts had no explanation. This was the Aegis Array, and it was Greg Holt's idea. The concept was simple, even if the engineering behind it was anything but. Each device in the array generated a focused gravitational disruption field. Individually, they were harmless. But when activated together, in the right sequence, at the right frequency, they could create a cascading wave of gravitational interference that would collapse any faster-than-light drive within range. Every ship caught in the effect would be instantly stranded, unable to jump away, unable to escape. They would be stuck in normal space, in human territory, surrounded by people who were very, very angry. The idea had come to Greg in the middle of the night, 3 weeks into the preparation. He had been reading old naval history, something he did when he could not sleep, and he had come across a story about minefields in ancient ocean warfare. You just needed to make the cost of coming through your door higher than they were willing to pay. The Aegis Array was a minefield, and the Sol system was the door. The assembly fleet stopped at the outer edge of sensor range, just beyond Neptune's orbit. For 3 hours, nothing happened. Both sides sat in the dark and watched each other across the vast emptiness of space. Then the Pale Silence opened a communication channel. The face that appeared on the Longhorn's main display was Scytharan. His name was Kale Vorin, and he was the fleet commander, a career military officer who had commanded enforcement actions against 4 other species in his long career. His crystalline features were sharp and precise, and his voice came through the translator as clipped and formal. Human vessel, this is Fleet Commander Kale Voren of the Galactic Interstellar Assembly Enforcement Division. You are in violation of Assembly Resolution 774. You have been ordered to stand down, disarm, and submit to quarantine procedures. This is your final notice. You have 1 standard hour to comply. Failure to comply will be considered an act of aggression and will be met with appropriate force. The channel stayed open. Voren waited. Greg Holt took a slow breath. He looked around his bridge. He looked at the young faces of his crew. He looked at Lily, who gave him a small nod. Then he looked back at the screen and spoke. Fleet Commander Voren, this is Admiral Greg Holt of the United Earth Defense Command. I have received your message. I want to make sure you receive mine clearly, so I am going to speak slowly. He leaned forward in his chair. You are entering sovereign human space. We did not ask for this confrontation. We did not seek it. We have broken no law that was not written specifically to punish us for the crime of being what we are. But I am not here to debate law with you. I am here to tell you a fact. He pointed at the sensor display, at the arc of pulsing devices behind his fleet. The devices behind my fleet are what we call the Aegis Array. It is a network of gravitational disruption emitters. If I give the order, they will activate simultaneously and collapse the faster-than-light drives of every ship within 600 million kilometers. That includes your entire fleet, every single vessel. If that happens, your 9,000 ships will be stuck here in our system, with no way to leave. And I want you to think very carefully about what happens next, because we have had 60 days to prepare for guests, and I promise you, the welcome will not be the kind you are hoping for. The channel was silent. On the bridge of the Longhorn, nobody moved, nobody breathed. Greg continued. I am not a diplomat. I do not have fancy words. I am a soldier, and I am going to tell you what a soldier sees. I see 9,000 ships that are a long way from home. I see supply lines that stretch across half the galaxy. I see crews that signed up for an enforcement action against a young species they were told would not fight back. And I see my people, Commander Voren, 297 ships crewed by men and women who have everything they love right behind them, their homes, their families, their entire world. There is nowhere for us to retreat to. There is nothing for us to fall back on. This is it. This is the line. He let that hang in the silence for a moment. So here is my offer. Turn your fleet around. Go home. Tell the Assembly that Earth is not interested in their quarantine. Tell them we are open to negotiation, to dialogue, to any peaceful resolution they want to propose. But tell them that the days of deciding humanity's fate without humanity's consent are over. We are done being told where we belong. You have 1 standard hour to respond. Holt, out. The channel closed. The bridge of the Longhorn was absolutely silent. Lily Tran looked at him. That was a good speech. Thank you. Does the Aegis Array actually work? Greg paused for just a moment. The engineering team says it should. Should? We have not exactly had time to test it on 9,000 ships. Lily stared at him. Then she let out a slow breath and shook her head. You are bluffing. I am not bluffing. I am being optimistic. There is a difference. 11 minutes passed. 11 minutes during which no one on either side of the standoff knew what would happen next. 11 minutes during which the fate of humanity and the future of the galaxy balanced on the edge of a knife. Then the sensor display flickered. The red contacts at the edge of the screen stopped moving forward. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, they began to drift backward. Kale Voren had ordered a full stop. Lily saw it first. She grabbed Greg's arm. They are stopping. They are pulling back to holding distance. Greg stared at the display. His hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against his knees, so nobody would see. No shot had been fired. No weapon had been used. No one had died. And yet, in that moment, everything changed. The oldest and most powerful civilizations in the galaxy had sent their mightiest fleet to crush a species that had been among the stars for less than 20 years. And that species had looked them in the eye and said no. The standoff had begun, and for the first time in the history of the assembly, the enforcers were the ones who blinked. The standoff lasted 43 days. 43 days of silence between two fleets separated by millions of kilometers of empty space. 43 days during which nobody fired a weapon, nobody made a move, and nobody blinked. But while the fleet sat still, the rest of the galaxy did not. The news of what happened at Sol spread faster than any official report could contain it. A young species had stared down the enforcement fleet of the most powerful governing body in galactic history, and the fleet had stopped. The story traveled through trade routes, communication relays, underground networks, and whispered conversations in embassy corridors on 100 different worlds. And everywhere it went, it lit fires. On the planet VoteHFY, a mining world controlled by the Scytheran Dominion for over 800 years, the native population put down their tools and refused to work. They had been watching human broadcasts for years, picking up signals that Earth had been sharing openly with anyone who wanted to listen. Ideas about self-determination, ideas about the right of a people to govern themselves, ideas that the Scytheran had spent centuries making sure the VoteHFY never heard. Now the VoteHFY had heard them, and they were done digging crystals out of the ground for masters who lived in towers they would never be allowed to enter. On 3 Malaxi colony worlds, populations that had been classified as secondary citizens for generations organized their first public assemblies. On a Droon border station, a group of junior officers from a dozen subjugated species filed a formal protest against their commanding officers for the first time in the station's history. Across the galaxy, on 14 different worlds where human-inspired independence movements had been quietly growing for years, those movements stopped being quiet. The assembly was cracking, and every day the standoff continued, the cracks got wider. On Verath Prime, Nate Caldwell worked. He slept in 2-hour intervals on the floor of his office, ate whatever Katie Marsh put in front of him, and spent every waking moment writing. What he was writing would later be called the Verath Accord, but in those early days it was just a document on a screen, full of crossed-out lines and margin notes and coffee stains. The idea behind it was something Nate had been thinking about for years, long before the vote, long before the crisis. The Galactic Interstellar Assembly was broken. It had always been broken. It was a system designed by the oldest species to serve the oldest species. A hierarchy that rewarded age and punished ambition. The Council of 12 held all the real power. Younger species were allowed to observe, to speak, and to trade, but they had no vote. They had no voice. They existed at the pleasure of civilizations that had decided, centuries ago, that the natural order of the galaxy was a ladder with themselves at the top. Nate wanted to replace the ladder with a table, a round table, where every species sat at the same level, where every voice carried the same weight, where the age of your civilization did not determine the value of your opinion. It was a simple idea. It was also the most radical proposal anyone had ever put before the galactic community. Katie Marsh helped him shape the language. She had a talent for translation that went beyond words. She understood how different species processed concepts, how the same phrase could mean hope to one culture and insult to another. She worked through the document, line by line, making sure that every clause could be understood by any species in the galaxy without distortion. Danny Rowe kept them safe. The human embassy on Verath Prime had become a target. Not physically, because even the assembly respected diplomatic immunity, at least for now, but politically. Scytheran agents had been spotted near the embassy's perimeter. Listening devices had been found in the walls. Danny swept the building every morning and every evening, and he made sure that when Nate held secret meetings, they stayed secret. And the meetings were happening. More and more species were reaching out to the human embassy through back channels. The Brelixi sent formal support through Sur. A delegation from the Corvathi, a species that had been silent in the assembly for 300 years, requested a private audience with Nate. So did representatives from over 40 younger species, who had never had the courage to speak against the elder races before. The Corvathi meeting changed everything. The Corvathi were old, older than the Sitharan, older than any species in the assembly. They had been the first civilization in the galaxy to achieve faster-than-light travel, and they had watched the rise and fall of empires that other species had not even known existed. They were an insectoid race, quiet and patient, with compound eyes that seemed to see in directions that other beings could not comprehend. They had withdrawn from active participation in the assembly centuries ago, choosing to observe rather than act. Nobody knew why. Nobody had dared to ask. Their representative arrived at the human embassy without announcement. Danny almost did not let the being inside, because it appeared out of nowhere at the embassy's back entrance at 3 in the morning, which was not the usual way diplomatic meetings began. But the Corvathi identified itself, and Danny, who had never seen a Corvathi before and found the experience both fascinating and slightly alarming, let it through. The Corvathi's name, as closely as human language could approximate it, was something like, "the one who remembers." It was old. Nate could tell by the way it moved, slowly and carefully, as though each step was a decision that required thought. It sat across from Nate in the embassy's small conference room, and it looked at him with those vast compound eyes, and it spoke. It spoke for a long time. It told Nate things about the assembly that were not in any public record. It told him about the founding, about how the first council had been created not to govern, but to prevent war, and how over the centuries it had become the very thing it was meant to stop. It told him about other species that had been quarantined, locked away, forgotten. Some of them were still out there, behind energy barriers, their worlds dark and silent. It told him that the Corvathi had withdrawn from the assembly because they had seen what it was becoming, and they had been ashamed, and that shame had kept them silent for 300 years. But silence is its own kind of failure, the Corvathi said. Its voice was dry and clicking, like branches in wind. We watched, we said nothing, and the assembly grew worse. Nate showed the Corvathi the draft of the Varath Accord. The old being read it slowly, its compound eyes moving across the text in a way that suggested it was reading every word multiple times. When it finished, it set the document down and looked at Nate. "This is what should have been built from the beginning," it said. "We would like to help you build it now." When the Corvathi representative rose in the great chamber of the assembly 2 days later and spoke publicly for the first time in 3 centuries, the effect was like a thunderclap in a silent room. The being spoke for 9 hours. It recounted the history of the assembly with a detail and precision that no living diplomat could match. It named the species that had been quarantined and forgotten. It described the decisions that had been made in secret, the deals that had been struck in darkness, the slow corruption of an institution that had once stood for something noble. And at the end of those 9 hours, it endorsed the Varath Accord. It endorsed humanity. It said, in terms that the translation systems rendered with absolute clarity, that the assembly had become a tyranny of the old over the young, and that it was time for the old to step aside. The chamber erupted, not in violence, but in chaos. The Scytheran delegation walked out. The Malaxi demanded an emergency recess. The Droons sat in stunned silence, which for a species that was rarely silent about anything, was remarkable. Within a week, the assembly had split. 6 elder species clung to the old order, led by the Scytheran. 6 sided with the Accord, led by the Corvathi and the Brelixi. Dozens of younger species declared their support for the new framework. Trade alliances shifted, military agreements were quietly voided, communication channels between old allies went dark. At Sol, the enforcement fleet received new orders. The Sitharan High Command, facing political collapse at home as their subject worlds continued to revolt, could no longer justify keeping 9,000 ships parked in a standoff they were not winning. The recall order came on the 43rd day. Admiral Greg Holt watched the fleet turn. 9,000 ships, the mightiest armada in galactic history, slowly reversed course and began the long journey home. The bridge crew of the Longhorn watched in silence. Some of them cried. Some of them laughed. Most of them just stared, because the sight of all those ships flying away from Earth was something none of them had truly believed they would live to see. Lily Tran stood beside Greg and watched the last of the red contacts fade from the sensor display. "Think they will come back?" she asked. Greg leaned back in his chair. He was tired. He was more tired than he had ever been in his life, but something in his chest felt lighter than it had in months. "Probably," he said. "But next time, we will not be alone." 1 year after the vote that was meant to end humanity's place among the stars, the galaxy looked nothing like it had before. The Vareth Accord was ratified on a warm afternoon in the great chamber above Vareth Prime. The same chamber where Nate Caldwell had been told that his species was no longer welcome in the galaxy. 212 species signed their names, or pressed their marks, or transmitted their consent through whatever means their biology and culture required. It was the largest single agreement in the recorded history of interstellar civilization, and it was signed in a room that still had the same color-shifting walls that had glowed hostile blue on the day of the vote. On this day, the walls glowed a color that the chamber's builders had never programmed. It was something between gold and white, and it seemed to pulse in time with the collective emotion of every being in the room. The chamber's systems did not have a label for it. The closest anyone came to naming it was a Bralexi delegate, who said it looked like the color of a sunrise on a world that had never seen one before. Nate Caldwell was there for the signing. He wore the same dark suit he had worn on the day of the vote, though Katie Marsh had insisted he at least get it cleaned. And he stood in the same spot where he had once been sentenced to quarantine. But this time he was not standing alone. Behind him were representatives from over 200 species, young and old, large and small, from worlds that had never had a voice and worlds that had chosen to give up their privileged voices so that others could speak. When the last signature was placed on the accord, the chamber broke into something that was not quite applause, because many of the species present did not have hands to clap with, but was unmistakably celebration. The Bralexi hummed. The Korvathi clicked their limbs together in rapid rhythmic patterns. A species of small, feathered beings from the outer rim let out a collective musical cry that sounded like a choir. And the humans, as humans tended to do in moments of overwhelming emotion, hugged whoever was standing closest to them, regardless of species, which caused some confusion among the more formal alien delegates, but was generally well received. The old assembly did not die that day. It simply became irrelevant. The Sitharan Dominion retreated into isolation, pulling back behind the borders of their core systems and severing communication with the wider galaxy. The subject worlds they had controlled for centuries celebrated their freedom, though the celebrations were tempered by the hard reality that freedom came with responsibilities that most of them were not yet prepared for. Human advisors, along with Bralexi mediators and Korvathi historians, spread across the newly independent worlds to help them build the foundations of self-governance. It was slow work, but it was good work, the kind of work that Nate Caldwell had always believed in. The other elder species that had voted against Earth responded in different ways. The Droon, who were fundamentally a practical people despite their intimidating appearance, were among the first to petition for membership in the Accord Council. Their representative, a gruff and heavily scarred commander named Thrak, stood before the council and said that the Droon had made a mistake, and that a species that could not admit its mistakes did not deserve to call itself civilized. The council accepted their petition. Thrak and Greg Holt later became unlikely friends, bonding over a shared appreciation for military strategy and a shared dislike of politicians, which Greg said was ironic, given that they were both now surrounded by them at all times. The Malaxi took longer to come around. They were a proud species, and the humiliation of the failed enforcement action sat heavily on them. But their younger generation, the ones who had grown up watching human broadcasts and reading human literature and listening to human music, pushed for change from within. Within 2 years, the Malaxi had a new governing council, and within 3, they had joined the Accord. Nate Caldwell was offered the position of first speaker of the Accord Council. It was the highest office in the new galactic government, and every delegate who proposed it said the same thing. Nate had built this. Nate deserved it. Nate said no. He said it kindly, because Nate always said things kindly, but he said it firmly. The position, he argued, should not go to a human. Humanity had been the spark, but the Accord was bigger than humanity. It belonged especially to the species that had suffered under the old system, the ones who had been silenced and subjugated and forgotten. The first speaker should be someone who understood that suffering firsthand. He nominated Sur, the old Brelixi diplomat, who had risked everything to meet Nate in that cold tunnel beneath the embassy, who had abstained from the vote when abstaining was the bravest thing anyone in the chamber had done, who had spent 60 years watching the assembly betray its own principles and had never stopped believing that something better was possible, sat in stunned silence when the nomination was announced. The vote was unanimous. Every single delegate, all 212 of them, voted yes. Sur accepted the position with a short speech that the translators rendered in every language in the galaxy. The old diplomat said only this: "I have waited my whole life to see this room full of equals. I will spend the rest of my life making sure it stays that way." And then Nate went home. He flew back to Earth on a commercial transport, sitting in a window seat with his thermos of coffee and a book he had been trying to finish for 3 months. Katie Marsh tried to convince him to take the ambassador's shuttle, but Nate said he had been an ambassador long enough. He wanted to ride with regular people. He wanted to hear them talk about normal things, about their jobs and their families and what they were going to have for dinner. He went back to Ohio. He went back to the same small town, the same school, the same classroom, with the same desk that still had the ring stain from his thermos on the corner. He taught history, but now his history classes had a few extra chapters in them, and on clear nights he took his students outside to the field behind the school and pointed up at the stars and told them about the time the galaxy voted to lock humanity away. The kids always asked the same question: "Were you scared?" And Nate always gave the same answer, every single day. But being scared is not the same as giving up. You can be scared and still stand your ground. You can be terrified and still do the right thing. That is what being brave means. It does not mean you are not afraid. It means you are afraid and you do it anyway. Admiral Greg Holt retired from active command. The United Earth Defense Command still existed, but its role had changed. It was no longer preparing for a war against the galaxy. It was now part of a joint defense initiative under the Accord, working alongside Brelexi engineers, Korvathi strategists, and even a few grudgingly respectful Droon tactical officers to build a shared security framework that protected everyone equally. Greg took a house on a lake in Montana. He fished. He sat on his dock in the mornings with a cup of coffee and watched the mist rise off the water, and he pretended that he did not miss the stars. He was not very good at pretending, and Lily Tran called him every week to tell him about whatever deep space expedition she was leading this time, which did not help. Lily had taken command of the Longhorn. She led the first joint human-Berlexi exploration mission beyond the galactic rim, into the vast empty space between galaxies where no one had ever gone before. She sent Greg photographs of nebulae that no living eye had ever seen, and he pinned them to the wall of his cabin next to his fishing licenses. Katie Marsh became the Accord's chief communications director. She built the new Interstellar Information Network from the ground up, replacing the Assembly's old censored relay system with an open network that any species could access. She believed that information should be free, and she spent the rest of her career making sure it was. Danny Rowe went back to security work, because Danny Rowe was not the kind of man who knew how to do anything else. He became the head of security for the Accord Council Chambers on Verath Prime, where he developed a reputation among the younger alien delegates as someone who was both deeply intimidating and surprisingly warm once you got to know him. He learned to say hello in 47 different alien languages and kept a small garden on the embassy roof where he grew tomatoes that several non-human species found unexpectedly delicious. President Laura Beckett served 2 more terms before stepping down. She had guided humanity through the greatest crisis it had ever faced, and she had done it without firing a single shot. In her final address, broadcast to every world in the Accord, she stood at the podium in Geneva and spoke the words that would become the unofficial motto of the new galactic age. They asked us to be small. We chose to be kind. And when they tried to make us disappear, we chose to build something bigger than any of us. The galaxy had voted against Earth. 11 of the 12 most powerful civilizations in the known universe had decided that humanity was too dangerous, too disruptive, too ambitious to be allowed among the stars. They had sent the largest fleet in history to enforce that decision. They had expected humanity to fold. They had not understood, because they could not understand, the one thing about humans that no predictive model could ever capture. It was not their technology. It was not their military strength. It was not their speed, or their innovation, or their stubborn refusal to follow rules that were designed to keep them down. It was the fact that when a human being was told that something was impossible, they did not hear a statement of fact. They heard a challenge. And when they were told they did not belong somewhere, they did not leave. They pulled up a chair, sat down, and started making the place better for everyone. Nate Caldwell finished his last class on a Friday afternoon in late October. The leaves outside were turning gold, and the light through the classroom windows was warm and soft. His students filed out, backpacks over their shoulders, talking about weekend plans. One of them, a quiet girl in the back row who reminded Nate a little of Katie Marsh, stopped at his desk on her way out. "Mr. Caldwell, do you think we will ever go back to the assembly? The old one, I mean?" Nate smiled. "There is no old assembly anymore. There is just the Accord. And yes, we will keep going. We will always keep going. That is what we do." The girl nodded and left. Nate sat at his desk for a moment, alone in the quiet classroom, and looked out the window at the sky. It was a clear evening. The first stars were beginning to show. He picked up his thermos, tucked his book under his arm, and walked out into the autumn air. Above him, the stars burned bright and endless, and somewhere out there, in the vast and wonderful galaxy that had tried to shut its door on his species and failed, the future was waiting. Humanity, as it always had, was on its way. Nate Caldwell had never wanted to be an ambassador. He had been a history teacher in a small town in Ohio, the kind of man who wore the same brown jacket every day, and kept a thermos of black coffee on his desk. He taught 8th graders about ancient Rome and the fall of empires, and he was good at it. He liked the work. He liked the quiet rhythm of his life. But the world had changed around him. First contact had come 23 years ago, when a Brelixi survey vessel dropped out of faster-than-light travel near Jupiter and sent a signal that every radio dish on Earth picked up at the same time. Within 5 years, humanity had joined the Galactic Interstellar Assembly, a governing body of over 400 spacefaring species that had existed for longer than human civilization itself. And within 10 years, the Assembly had started to notice something about humans that made them very, very nervous. Humans moved fast, they learned fast, they built fast. They took alien technology and improved it. They opened trade routes that disrupted old monopolies. They shared ideas freely with anyone who wanted to listen, and a lot of species wanted to listen. 14 worlds under the control of elder species had seen independence movements rise among their populations. Movements inspired by human ideas about freedom and self-governance. The elder races did not like this. They did not like this at all. Nate had been pulled into diplomacy because he had a gift. He could talk to anyone. He could sit across from a 10-foot crystalline being from the Cytheran Dominion and speak to it like it was just another person in a room. He did not get scared. He did not get angry. He listened, and then he spoke. And when he spoke, people understood him. The United Earth Coalition had noticed this talent when Nate was part of a cultural exchange program on the Brelixi homeworld, and they had asked him to stay. That was 6 years ago. Now he was the highest-ranking human diplomat in the galaxy, standing in a chamber that floated in orbit above a neutral world called Verath Prime, and he was watching everything fall apart. The chamber was enormous. It had been built to hold representatives from hundreds of species, and its curved walls were made of a material that shifted color depending on the emotional state of the majority of beings inside it. Right now, the walls were a deep, cold blue. Nate had learned enough about the chamber to know that blue meant hostility. The High Speaker of the Cytheran Dominion stood at the central podium. His name was VoteHFY, and he was ancient even by Cytheran standards. His body was a towering structure of pale crystal, and his voice came out as a harmonic vibration that the translation systems converted into flat, emotionless words. He had been speaking for nearly an hour, and every word was aimed at Earth. The charge was something called accelerated cultural contamination. It was a legal term that the Assembly had invented centuries ago to deal with species that grew too influential too quickly. In practice, it meant that the elder races had decided that humanity was a threat to their power, and they were using the rules they had written themselves to shut humanity down. The proposed punishment was severe. Earth would lose all interstellar travel rights, every human colony, and there were now 17 of them spread across 3 sectors, would be forcibly relocated back to the Sol system. And a Class 7 energy barrier, the most powerful containment field the Assembly could deploy, would be placed around the entire solar system. Humanity would be locked in its own backyard, cut off from the rest of the galaxy, possibly forever. Nate stood at the small podium reserved for the accused. He was alone. The rules of the Assembly allowed only a single representative to speak in defense during a formal tribunal. He wore a simple dark suit, the same kind he might have worn to a parent-teacher conference back home. He did not look like a man who held the future of his species in his hands. He looked like a tired teacher who had been grading papers too late into the night. He asked for time. He used every diplomatic tool he had. He cited precedent. He pointed out that humanity had broken no existing law, that the charge of cultural contamination had not been applied in over 2,000 years, and that the last species it had been used against, the Korvathi, had been one of the founding members of the Assembly itself. He asked for a formal review period. He asked for mediation. The Council of 12 listened. 12 elder species, the oldest and most powerful civilizations in the galaxy, each with a single vote that could shape the fate of worlds. Nate watched their representatives as he spoke. Some of them would not even look at him. The Cytheran delegation stared straight ahead with their cold, glowing eyes. The Moloxi, a species of tall, thin beings with silver skin, kept their faces perfectly blank. The Brelixi representative, an elderly amphibian diplomat named Sur, watched Nate with something that might have been sadness. When Nate finished speaking, VoteHFY did not bother to respond to any of his arguments. He simply called the vote. It happened fast. One by one, the elder species cast their decisions. The Scytherin voted yes. The Moloxi voted yes. The Droon, a species of massive armored beings who controlled the largest military fleet in the assembly, voted yes. On and on it went. Yes, yes, yes. 11 votes in favor of the motion. Only Sur abstained. The old Brelixi diplomat pressed no button, cast no vote. But Nate saw the way Sur's wide, dark eyes lingered on him, and he understood. The Brelixi could not save humanity. Not here, not today. But they had refused to participate in the killing blow, and in the politics of the assembly, that was its own kind of message. The motion passed. The chamber hummed with finality. VoteHFY turned his crystalline body toward Nate, and spoke in that flat, translated tone. The representative of Earth may now withdraw. The enforcement timeline begins at the conclusion of this session. Earth has 60 standard days to comply. Nate did not move. He stood at his small podium, his hands flat on its surface, and he looked up at the towering figures that surrounded him. 400 species watched. Thousands of diplomats and observers filled the upper galleries. Recording systems broadcast the session to every corner of the galaxy. Nate Caldwell, a former history teacher from a small town in Ohio, opened his mouth and spoke 6 words into the silence. You have made a terrible mistake. The translation systems processed the words and sent them ripple through every speaker, every earpiece, every neural receiver in the chamber. The walls of the room flickered. The blue shifted, just for a moment, to something darker. Something the chamber had no color for, because no species in the recorded history of the assembly had ever stood where Nate stood, and said what Nate said, and meant it the way he meant it. VoteHFY stared at him. For the first time in the entire session, the high speaker had no prepared response. Nate picked up his thermos from the podium, turned his back on the Council of 12, and walked out of the chamber. His footsteps echoed in the silence. Nobody stopped him. Nobody said a word. Behind him, the walls of the chamber stayed dark for a very long time.